libraries.
And in the next 2 months, going to read 5 books on the bestseller list.
The reason the book, I think, hopefully works is that it's very much a first-person account.
It was an enormous amount of investigative work, but it was really very worthwhile.
And it was really quite an unbelievable experience during that period of time to be there.
It was a new sort of dream.
Welcome to Conversations. My name is Scott Churchill. Our guest today is Wade Davis, ethnobotanist and anthropologist and author of The Serpent and the Rainbow. Wade, unlike your financial backers who seem to be interested mostly in the chemical formula of the toxins responsible for zombification, you said you were interested in knowing the magic, the spirit of the world of the Haitians. Was this interest there for you from the very beginning?
Not really, Scott. I have no intrinsic interest in the supernatural at all. What I really meant by that comment is that no drug can be taken out of its cultural context. I went to Haiti on a apparently strange mission, as it were, to look for the toxin that had been implicated in this zombie phenomena. But there's just absolutely no way that you can isolate the chemical event from the sociological matrix. Let me give you, mainly because, any drug used in a culture, no drug has an ability to create a social phenomena. A drug is, in some sense, has a completely ambivalent potential for good or bad, and it becomes just a template on which cultural beliefs and forces, psychological pressures can go to work. So in that sense, it wasn't as much that I was intrigued by Haitian voodoo. Indeed, I knew nothing about Haitian voodoo. I knew nothing about Haitian history when I began the assignment. It was rather that I knew from my work in the Amazon that I couldn't begin to be able to say anything about the phenomena of the Haitian zombie just by looking at the drug alone.
Yeah.
I had to look at the social context.
This feature of your work was reminiscent, and by now you're probably tired of the comparisons to Carlos Castaneda. But the part I was intrigued by was starting out with an interest in plant life, in the psychotropic aspects of plants, and then discovering that, as you say, that involves a whole cultural context for it. Do you feel that you came away with the understanding of the magic that you were looking for?
Well, I don't know if I would begin to say I understood the magic. I certainly didn't become a participant or an acolyte of the faith. What I did come away with understanding the magical rationale of the event within the mindset of the Haitian people. And that became very, very important, because one thing we had to figure out in this whole process is we knew for a fact that the fish, which are the source of the toxin, or 50% of the time they don't have the toxin in them. The biogenesis of the toxin is not completely understood, and we knew that there were all kinds of places for the process not to work. Someone could easily suffocate in the coffin, someone could not get enough of the toxin, and there had to be some means within the closed system of belief that typified the Haitian voodoo worldview. There had to be some means of that sorcerer rationalizing his failures while he emphasized his successes. And it was to understand how he did that, in other words, would prevent that belief system from exposing itself to falsification. It was in order to understand how they did that, how they rationalized the event, I had to understand the magic, and that's what I did.
Well, it's easy to talk about sitting here in a library in the United States, but to read the book and to be taken almost by the hand with you into the bush and into these magic ceremonies was almost frightening at points.
Well, I think that, the reason the book, I think, hopefully works is that it's very much a first-person account in which I share both my intrigue, my intellectual and philosophical intrigue, but also, and my adventures to some extent, but also my naivete.
Yeah.
And one thing we have to step back and note is that I didn't know a bloody thing about voodoo, and I think I had all the preconceptions that anybody has, even in the universities here, about voodoo and zombies and so on and so forth. And I first took the assignment to look for the so-called zombie poison very much as a lark.
Yeah.
It was a February day in Boston, raining like anything, when my professor came and asked me, do you want to go to 2 weeks in the Caribbean? And I really didn't know a lot about the culture. And one of the interesting parts of the research is that I went down to Haiti and almost instantly, from the time I got off the plane, became aware that this was a culture where things were not as they appeared. In other words, I later distilled that perception into an awareness that for the Haitian voodooists, the line between the material and the immaterial realm is a fine one indeed, and that the ease with which the Haitian moves in and out of his spiritual realm is quite astounding to a foreign observer. And so having seen that, I began to get what I used to, sort of a sense of the certain symbols of the space, I used to call it, the symbols that told me that this was not the kind of place I had visited in my other travels. I mean, I'm talking about as simple as something like seeing a perfectly sane man standing in the sunshine on a hot afternoon day dancing with his own shadow, completely healthy and happy, or going to a nightclub and seeing a voodooist possessed by the spirits and handling burning embers, despite the fact that it was a nightclub. You know, and knowing that this was not, it wasn't a question of whether it's true voodoo or false voodoo. The point is that that individual could conjure up out of his spiritual realm some kind of force that allowed him to handle these burning embers with impunity. And these are the sorts of things that made me incredibly impressed by that culture.
It seemed that by the end of the book, you were more than an aloof observer or someone, I mean, you're being very self-effacing, I think, in saying that it seemed that you really got caught up into the spell of it all.
Well, I think, Scott, that's a really good point, and I think I didn't realize how deeply I had gone not even until I got back, until years later. Because, of course, let's step back, and I started off as a sort of Western scientist going down to look for a folk toxin that had potential medical applications. I found that toxin. I documented a case of an individual who had actually been misdiagnosed dead, had somehow been buried and brought back into the realm of the living. But all the time I was doing it all within the context of my own rational Western scientific perspective. But then as things went on, and when I started asking the more interesting questions, like how would the person's psychological and spiritual beliefs mediate the pharmacological event of the poison, when I started to ask, well, what is this voodoo worldview all about, I did start getting swept into a certain vortex. And I think then when I really asked the question, why would this be going on, and I suddenly started brushing up against the Bizango secret societies of the night, and started working what I used to sort of facetiously call the night shift, where for weeks at a time I didn't see the sunlight because I was going to the clandestine ceremonies at night. And when I started doing things like going into the graveyards and stealing bodies out of the corpses of the dead in order to make these preparations, and you know, I was starting to cross moral and ethical lines that only later did I suffer the full ramifications of in some sense.
Wow.
You know, I think it manifested itself in the fact that when I finally left Haiti, you know, for some people the end of the book may fall flat to some extent because basically what happened is I got terribly ill. I had hepatitis and malaria at the same time, and I simply had to get out of the country.
Yeah.
But I was always curious, as the voodooists were, in why I got those diseases at that time. And they said, of course, because of what you've been messing around with.
Yeah.
There's some truth there.
So the ending worked for me. In a way, by the time I got to the part 3, and you were giving the historical context and the religious context for the practices of voodoo, I began to sense that no magic was going to be written in a Western man's book, and perhaps that's why they were able to let you go with it, when they said you can have the song but not the words.
Well, that's very much what they said. I asked them at one point, why are you letting me have this information? And one of the answers I got is that, Blanc, we will give you the powder, we'll allow you to see zombies come out of the ground, you can do anything you want, but you will never know the magic.
Yeah.
And that's critical, because from their point of view, of course, it's not a powder that makes a zombie. It's the power of the magic and the magical beliefs that mediate the phenomenon. Yeah. And that's what they said they were not going to tell me. Of course, in the end, they told me, so I did learn the magic.
Yeah. But you don't reveal all of that.
I don't reveal all that in the book, no.
And in a way, it makes me think of the whole fantasy of the Enlightenment, that science is going to clarify all of the mysteries of the world and lead to our own redemption through that. But there's a kind of Faust...
I think that's a bit of an illusion. I always think that the purpose of science is not to create absolute truths, but to create better and better ways of thinking about phenomena that we see around us all the time. And I think that's what I was really trying to do with this research, was not... It's been written up in so many sensational ways. Fundamentally, I think the contribution of this research is that I took a phenomenon which had been really exploited almost in an explicitly racist way to denigrate a people. I mean, all our notions of zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, of voodoo dolls with pins and needles, these are just straight fantasy of foreigners. And hopefully I turned that phenomenon on its head and showed that it had a basis in pharmacology, and it also had a basis in sociology. I mean, the bottom line is it turns out that a zombie is someone who suffers a form of social sanction. It's a punishment meted out by the secret societies in a way which is completely consistent with the ethnographic roots in West Africa and what we know about secret societies there.
Speaking of the plant side of this, because you began your work as an ethnobotanist, in the early chapters of the book you mentioned that I think in South America in general you'd had some experience with various psychoactive plants. Are there any particular of those that stand out for you that were either life transformative or that particularly revelatory experiences you had?
It's a difficult thing to say. I mean, I think that some of the experiences I went through, I did a plant called ayahuasca, the vision vine, the dead man's vine, the vine of the soul. It's a very interesting liana from the Amazon, and I went through a shamanistic experience in Ecuador amongst the Ingano Indians, I mean in Colombia, in the Putumayo. And what was interesting about this substance is that it's got a series of beta-carbolines in it, but the compounds were originally called telepathine because it gives us a subjective impression of a kind of a shared experience, a communal experience. In fact, that's one of the Amazon drugs that some ethnographers have reported that the Indians actually use it during their passage rites as a means of initiating the young, such that the shaman is said, and who knows if it's true, to actually conjure up the beasts of the forest such that the initiate can learn their ways. Now, whether this goes on or not, I don't know, but I certainly did go through a very interesting ceremony with a shaman in which I became intoxicated and the whole world just sort of collapsed in colors around me. And he, meanwhile, he felt he was transforming me into various animals, and he rubbed my arms with stinging nettles and sprayed me with his saliva and sucked on all parts of my body to take various forces out, and finally rubbed me with these quartz crystals that they called the fruit of the forest. And that was a pretty extraordinary experience. I mean, that was years ago. I was only 20, so I think then it was even more impressionistic.
How did you get involved in this kind of exploration as a 20-year-old?
Well, my father sent me to Colombia when I was 14 by myself to learn Spanish, and I always was intrigued by Latin America. And people often ask me how I got into this work, and I think that one of the reasons is that my father was a banker, and I loved him very much. But he used to refer to his work as going to the grind, and when I was a little boy, I used to really think that it meant that Dad got up in the morning, walked to the train station, got to his office, stood on his head, and was spun until he got shorter and shorter, and then he'd come home exhausted at night. And the other influence was, believe it or not, and I know a Harvard PhD is not supposed to acknowledge these sorts of pedestrian routes, but I love the TV show Wagon Train. And whenever the Indians attacked and they came over the hill and they destroyed the wagons, I'd never cared what happened to the wagons. I wanted to know where those Indians went when they went back over that hill. And I just had a fascination and a love for Indians, and then being from Canada, I was able to live with Indians from a very early age, fighting forest fires, logging, and so on. So when it came time to pick a major at college, anthropology seemed like a natural. And then what happened is I met one extraordinary man who became my mentor, who was in both the movie and my book, Professor Richard Evans Schultes, who was the head of the Botanical Museum. Now, Schultes had literally in the 1930s taken a semester's leave of absence from Harvard and disappeared into the Amazon for 8 years. And he was really the pioneer, the father of psychotropic study of psychotropic drugs. And when Timothy Leary discovered LSD in the early 60s, he came to Schultes and said, "What should I call this?" And Schultes said, "Psychodelic." And when Leary said he thought psychedelic sounded better, Schultes disowned him because it was improper Greek. You know, so I mean, Schultes has been in there since the beginning, and but he himself, his politics are so conservative. He's to the right of Attila the Hun. He won't use the Kennedy stamp, for example. I mean, so he's a real enigma, but this fascinating character who was a myth on the campus at Harvard when I was an undergraduate. So he really became my mentor, and it was through his support that I first went to the Amazon, where I stayed myself for 3 years.
Yeah. It seemed that your experiences from the past in the Amazon and Canada were part of the way you kept your wits about you when you had to wing it with the shamans.
Absolutely. You know, often people say, you know, how did you do it? How did you get this information? How did the white man get this information? Well, that's an easy answer for that. The answer is, thank God there's one place on earth where they don't judge you by the color of your skin.
Right.
But I didn't really realize how much I had learned to deal with the foreign cultures until I started taking people like my scientific backer and financial backer on the project down to Haiti, and I noticed this sort of concrete wall between my informants and those individuals from the States, in the sense that, you know, none of this work is accomplished by ethnographers by macho or by bravado or by threatening anyone or by buying anything. I like to say that you get successful results through love and empathy, and that may sound hopelessly naive, but it's simply my experience that by going down to these places and sharing the food, living with them, sleeping with them on the stony ground, basically showing that there is needs to be no distance. It may sound like Pollyanna or naive, but in fact that's how I've always accomplished what I have. And it's been quite successful in the case of Haiti.
I was struck by the fact that your, I don't know whether to call her an assistant or not, Rachel, down there, also seemed to, well, she was part of that culture, and yet the secret societies remained an enigma to her to some extent.
Well, the secret societies have a very nefarious public face in Haiti, and if you ask any Haitian person, particularly from the countryside, they will describe the secret societies as the most fearsome den of sorcerers, you know, criminals of a special kind, they've been called. And this public face is sort of maintained quite deliberately by the secret society, and it ties into both the nature of the Bizango rite within the overall spectrum of voodoo worship, and it ties into also the function of the Bizango, which is very much as a political and social force, an arbiter of political life in the countryside in Haiti. So that is a very common perception that the people themselves have. When you get inside the Bizango, you suddenly see that there's another role, a role which is much more like a mutual support group.
Yeah, very benevolent, in fact.
Benevolent within, but as they say, the society can be very sweet only because it can be very bitter. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, certainly the historical context, which you very compellingly unfold in the final chapters of the book, the slave trading, the Maroons, was that the name?
Yeah, well, I think the history of the country is so fascinating and so poorly known in the West, you know, and you must understand it to understand the phenomena of voodoo, the zombies and so on, because it's that unique history, the fact that it was the richest colony of an imperial age, the fact that it had the only successful slave revolt in history, the fact that in the wake of that revolt, a blanket of isolation came on the country, and at the time of that, beginning of that period of isolation, there were about 500,000 Africans, and of those, literally the vast majority had been born in Africa, and so what grew out of that isolation was a society which you can't really say was quote-unquote African, because that implies a uniformity to African culture that ethnography does not support, but the traits that society shared in that remote hinterland of Haiti were African traits, and because of that there emerged really two halves of the Haitian reality. On the one hand, an urban economic and political elite that looked in every way to France for inspiration. They spoke the French, they practiced the Roman Catholic faith, they sent their children abroad for recreation and education, they had a code of laws invented in Paris. On the other hand, you had this voodoo society, Guinea society, which not only was fused together by the beliefs of voodoo, but it also had a system of health and healing that was unique to itself. It practiced polygamy, the equality of the sexes, the role of women in the market economy, the nature of education. This was a world apart, and within that world, one finds completeness. One of the interesting things I think about the research, and one of the ways that the quest went from a quest for a drug to a quest for understanding, was the fact that I draw a distinction in the book between what I call the Descartesian Western way of thinking and the thinking that typifies a closed system of belief. Now let me give you an example. If you had a heart attack right now, Scott, in this chair, and your family asked, why did Scott die in the chair? Well, we might say he had a cholesterol problem or that he had a genetic predisposition, but no, we said, no, why right then at that moment when he was interviewing Wade Davis? We would say, well, that was chance, coincidence, or fate, but those are meaningless euphemisms which simply leave the question open and allow us to avoid asking the fundamental question. I mean, it's just a dodge which allows us this open route of thought in a way, whereas a belief like West African religious beliefs or voodoo, which by definition is a closed system of belief in which everything has an answer, that voodoo practitioner would give you all numbers of answers. And the legitimacy of those answers can't be measured by us. That they are, so at some level, they're inherently legitimate. And the important point then is that within that web of belief, the individual voodooist can maneuver with great intellectual ingenuity, but by definition they cannot step outside of that closed system of beliefs, otherwise the whole set of beliefs shatters. Yeah. And when you have someone brought up in that belief system like that, then you get on it, but the very fascinating question is how can those beliefs work through the individual psychology to mediate, say, a chemical event of him receiving a poison? And that's what I thought was so fascinating. And it gets you into the whole literature that you're probably familiar with on just the fact that apparently the mind has the ability to affect the body that bears it, the fact that you know, that psychogenic illness and death, the notion that somehow we are more susceptible to illnesses when we are depressed or whatever. All that.
You're existentially vulnerable. That's when you'll find an illness.
And that was so important when you looked at the zombie thing, and that was really the hidden element in trying to figure this out, is that you could find out, okay, a drug could make someone appear to be dead even though that person was alive. That's scientifically verifiable, no problem. And that's what we did. Yeah. You could show a case of an individual who apparently had this experience. But then the questions got really interesting, like, okay, how would his preconceived notions of this have affected him? Because remember that in Haiti, the fear is not of zombies, as movies would make you think, it's of becoming one. Right. No Haitian peasant doubts the existence of zombies. By emically or by local belief, by definition, they exist, and that those beliefs then have an exclusive validity. And how do those beliefs affect psychology? Right. And it's interesting because the word psychosomatic does not mean fake; it means mind-body. Exactly. You know, and it's just an interesting.
It's not malingering. It's not hysteria. It's the unity. In fact, I think your book and your research is a good testimony to post-Cartesian thinking. You mentioned Descartes' view of the universe, where the whole is reduced to the part, divided to the part. And that's like some of the backers, perhaps, who wanted just the potion. They wanted to reduce the Haitian voodoo culture to simply a chemical formula. But you discovered the opposite. To understand the formula, it has to be done from the point of view of the whole culture.
Well, the thing is that, you know, a drug, as I said earlier, has an ambivalent potential. And a great example of that would be the psychoactive mushrooms of Oregon. When the hippies go out into the fields looking for these psychoactive mushrooms, they generally experience a mild intoxication. When nice families go out looking for edible field mushrooms and inadvertently eat the psychoactive ones, they invariably end up in the poison clinic at the hospital. The mushroom hasn't changed. What has changed is a set of expectations brought to the experience. And that was what was so intriguing about the question in Haiti, was to find out what those beliefs were. Yeah. And you know, and when you look at that, you see that a zombie is someone who has suffered the ultimate social sanction of their society, and these people know why they're being made zombies. Yeah.
Along the lines of the psychotropic plants, there was other evidence you presented that human remains were among the most toxic.
No, I didn't say they're amongst most toxic. It was that they are of the consistent ingredients. One of them is human remains. Yeah. Now we don't think there's any chemical basis to that, but it's rather for the magical power of the bones.
They're again the psychosomatics of it then.
But one of the things that I try to stress whenever I talk about voodoo is to kind of there are a number of symbols of voodoo that turn individuals off, like using human bones. Well, I try to always get back to the old truism that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. The voodooists use bones because they think that bones have certain power, the power of the dead. But the Roman Catholic Church does the same thing. If you go to St. Peter's, you go into the catacombs, you see row after row of bones, the relics of the saints. So it's always good to do that in terms of voodoo, because to try to, you know, put it in this proper perspective.
Before we run out of time, I want to get to the issue of dreaming. Part of the bracketing of the bubble of perception of everyday life, or of the scientific worldview, in order to see, is a common theme in whether in your book or Castaneda's. in the film version.
In the film especially, you're going to...
Now, dreaming, I know, is a particular interest of Wes Craven, who directed the film. I was waiting for Freddie to come back in your film. I wondered if the use of dream images was more idiosyncratic to the director, or if that, in fact, was part of how the magic works on the people.
I think both. The answer to that is that they both are true. Wes has used that device very effectively, and he uses that device very effectively in this movie to show the protagonists going deeper and deeper into voodoo and gradually becoming affected, as I've tried to suggest I became affected. And then the nightmares are just a two-dimensional celluloid representation of the psychological trauma that the protagonist feels as he's dealing with things that he was not brought up to deal with. Mm-hmm. That's working on one level. Now the voodooists, for their point, there's no separation between their levels of reality. Dreams are real to the voodooists. And they walk in and out of their dream world as they walk in and out of their spirit realm with complete ease and impunity. Mm-hmm. And so they take their dreams to be real because they believe in the reality of their dreams.
Were your dreams ever affected by this, as in the film version?
No, but I think that it was working on a much more subliminal level with me. I mean, I think it was manifesting itself in ways I still can't get my finger on, but I'm convinced to this day that I succumbed to these diseases, for example, because of my body was basically saying enough, time to go home at one level. I really believe that.
Yeah. What next?
Well, I've got a book coming out which is basically my PhD thesis called Passage of Darkness, which gets into a lot of these issues we've touched upon in a much more deeper way than in Serpent and the Rainbow. Mm-hmm. And now I'm working on a book called Sheets of Distant Rain, which is a story of a wilderness area completely unrelated to voodoo. It's a wilderness area in northern Canada where I lived with some Athabascan Indians, and it's about their worldview and how they interact with the land. I guess you can start seeing a theme in my work, and you referred to Castaneda. You know, he's gotten a bum rap in a way because people are concerned that it's fiction or non-fiction, and at one level, who cares? Yeah. I mean, I think that his great gift to all of us was that he turned an entire generation onto the notion of separate realities, that you can, that cultures can define their realities. You know, anthropologists call it cultural relativism, and I think that that's a very important thing, because I think that what we must understand is that we do invent our realities, and the only way we can build really pluralistic societies based on equality is not to try to create a sort of a homogeneous mass of humanity, but to recognize both the commonality between the human experience cross-culturally and the uniqueness of our own abilities to quite benignly reinvent our realities to create particular culture. And if this era of the 20th century is going to be remembered for anything, it's going to be the time when it's not going to be for our wars or our technological advance, it's going to be the time when we stood by and passively accepted or actively endorsed the complete destruction of biological and cultural diversity on the planet. Yeah. So I think Castaneda had a very good lesson to teach us all. Well, like Castaneda, your book is good anthropology in the sense that it makes us aware of our own culture as culture by inviting us into a new one. This has been fascinating talking with you. Great, thanks. I wish we had more time. I do too. Thank you for all listening, and we'll be back again.
Because I would do anything.
Theater, sponsored by the